Lancaster Historical for inviting me. Thank you. I'll start with a synopsis, followed by a few images. Then I'll address most frequently asked questions. Then do a couple of short readings. Then open up for questions. Bathsheba Spooner was the next to last, of 7 children born to Timothy Ruggles and Bathsheba born Newcomb. Mrs. Ruggles had birthed 8 children from her first marriage. Her mother's roots were firmly planted in one of Cape Cod's oldest families. Her father's from Roxbury. Timothy was born in 1711, a descendant of a family long involved in Massachusetts politics, but none would enjoy the status to which he would rise. A brigadier general in the French and Indian War, he had also served as Speaker of the House for 2 years. His reputation suffered dramatically when, as delegate to the Stamp Act Congress of 1765 in New York, he refused to join those protesting the actions of Parliament and King George III. Now firmly placed in the camp of those loyal to the king, he freely accepted the position of mandamus counselor, one of the men who were appointed by the king's governor to the Upper Massachusetts House to do the king's bidding. Few men were as detested in Massachusetts in the year 1774. That year, he was banished from his new hometown of Hardwick, a town his ancestors had founded and he himself nurtured. He remained in British-controlled Boston until Evacuation Day, March 17, 1776, when he was removed with most Tories to Staten Island. In the meantime, daughter Bathsheba had married Joshua Spooner of Boston, a businessman / land speculator / lumber salesman. The couple settled in Brookfield, not far from nearby Hardwick. The marriage may have been an arranged one, a marriage which gossipers usually characterized as inharmonious. 16-year-old militiaman Ezra Ross of Topsfield, a native of Ipswich, left his hospital camp in 1777 in Peekskill, New York, to venture home. En route, he was taken in by Bathsheba in Brookfield and nursed back to health. He returned to Topsfield, then headed west again that fall to join what would become the Battle of Saratoga. The British had hoped to cut New England off from the remaining 9 colonies, General Burgoyne's troops heading south to meet up with General Howe's troops heading north. It was not to be. Howe instead focused on Philadelphia, leaving Burgoyne to fend off the increasing masses of American troops north of Albany. His entire army surrendered to American General Gates. Marched to Boston, the British POWs were quartered in Cambridge and Charlestown. Both Sergeant James Buchanan and Private William Brooks managed to escape, not a difficult task, and likely met each other in Worcester for the first time. Now February 1778, the men were apparently headed to Springfield for work when during a fierce snowstorm they were called into the Spooner home. They remained there for the next few weeks, Bathsheba plotting her husband's murder with them. In the meantime, young Ezra Ross, just having attempted to poison Mr. Spooner, left with him to prepare his Princeton property, soon to be handed over to Spooner's brother. Ross never made it to Princeton, apparently borrowing Spooner's horse to return to Topsfield. All rendezvoused in Brookfield the evening of March 1st, 1778. It is unclear if their meeting was coincidental or arranged. Having dined with a friend and his wife, Joshua returned home alone through the snow and was assaulted at his well, beaten to death, and thrown in while his wife finished eating her dinner. The clothes he wore and those from his chamber, along with his cash, were distributed among the 3 men who fled on horseback and foot. All were arrested the next day. The trial took place in Worcester in late April. Abraham Lincoln's distant cousin as defense attorney, Robert Tree Payne, a signer of the Declaration as prosecutor, in a trial organized by acting Governor John Hancock. With the trial lasting just over a day plus, all were found guilty. The date of execution was originally set for early June, but the 4 received a stay until July 2nd. Bathsheba claimed pregnancy. The officials in Boston allowed an exam to be done, proving that she was not with child. She insisted a second exam, not authorized, instead confirmed her pregnancy, but the Boston authorities would not relent. Despite an informal 3rd exam proving her right, her execution date was not changed. And thanks to Heather for research she did on William Greenleaf. Greenleaf was the sheriff of Worcester County at the time. He was a native of Lancaster. He was born in 1738. At one point, his family had occupied the town's mansion house, which still stands on Neck Road. A captain in the militia, as brother-in-law to Governor John Hancock, Greenleaf enjoyed an exalted status. Present at Spooner's execution, the sheriff had earlier signed the affidavit confirming that Spooner was not pregnant as assessed during her first exam. Greenleaf celebrated with his fellow patriots at Lancaster's Swan Tavern a month following the defeat of Cornwallis at Yorktown, leading a parade through the town. In 1786, he defended the Worcester County Courthouse, countering farmers engaged in the first rebellion against the U.S. government, Shays Rebellion. As sheriff, he had helped in the state's seizure of the farmers' properties seized for non-payment of what the farmers considered to be excessive taxes. Greenleaf was the first individual to be impeached in Massachusetts, removed from his post in 1788. Convicted of malfeasance, the chief charges against him involved the misappropriation of funds. Greenleaf died in 1793, a bankrupt. There is no record of his place of burial. On June 10th, Abigail Adams wrote to her son John Quincy with his father in Paris. The modern history of our own times furnishes as black a list of crimes as can be paralleled in ancient time, even if going back to Nero, Caligula, or Cesare Borgia. All 4 accomplices were hanged July 2nd. An autopsy requested by Bathsheba confirmed her pregnancy of 5 months with a male child. Timothy Ruggles eventually found his way to Nova Scotia, where, as a loyal servant to the crown, he was granted a multi-hundred-acre estate, which he fostered as he had his legendary estate in Hardwick. His wife chose to stay behind in Massachusetts with their son. Timothy died in 1795 and was buried near his home in Nova Scotia. To this day, the burial site in Green Hill Park in Worcester of Bathsheba and her unborn son has never been located. It remains Worcester County's favorite mystery. This is Bathsheba's father, Timothy Ruggles.
Lights out?
Sorry?
Lights out?
Sure.
Okay. The other light?
I think it's equal.
I see pretty well.
I think it's good.
Okay,
Yeah,
all right.
that's fine. This is courtesy of Library of Congress. This is the only image we have of Ruggles, and in fact, it's a reproduction of the original, which is lost. See the next?
Okay, let's see.
This is courtesy of the Worcester Art Museum. This is the Ruggles estate in Hardwick. It was painted by a relative in Connecticut. Ruggles' home is actually on the right-hand side here. The art is for artistic purposes at
Right
the
there.
house, yeah, to balance the composition. You can see a cleric in red in the middle doorway there. Ruggles, strangely, was a Congregationalist, which was very unusual for Anglicans, or for Loyalists. Most Loyalists were Anglican. But again, having many friends that were Loyalists, not so strange maybe, that a bishop might be visiting him or a cleric. You can see a little girl just hanging out the window on top, right there in the window. She looks about 12 years old. Could be
Right
Bathsheba.
there.
Yeah.
Could
Possible.
be Bathsheba.
Possible. Yeah. Nothing survives of the property today. The land is still vacant. I think there's a well in the distance and a few field stones. That's all that's left in Hardwick. Next.
Who actually owns the property?
That's a good question. I imagine the town does,
Okay.
though I'm not sure of that. It's an early 19th century print of Staten Island, where Ruggles was exiled to, along with most Tories from New England.
And he stayed there how long?
Good question. So he was there in, not very long, a year maybe? Maybe a year.
And then he went
Because
up.
he headed back to Boston and then evacuated, yeah, I'd say about a year.
Okay. Next one.
Sure. New York remained the center of Loyalist power during the entire Revolution. So. Does this look familiar to anyone?
Oh, yes.
The Rotunda in Washington, Capitol Rotunda. This is the Battle of Saratoga by John Trumbull. Fanciful depiction. It was painted 40 years after the event. So we have the British general surrendering to Gates in the middle there. And this was the last battle site of the 3 murderers.
Okay, next.
Sure. In 1976, Brookfield Historic Commission put this up at the murder site in Brookfield. The house came down, we think, around in the 1850s. There's a photograph in the Worcester Telegram in the 1920s showing people surrounding the well, and in the distance you see the barn still standing, but it looked pretty rickety. I'm guessing the barn probably lasted 10 or 20 more years. The men had spent several nights in the barn. That's also gone. All that survives today is the well cap, which is this big. And I spoke in Brookfield last October, and the current owner of the property, I asked him, they said, is that possible that the well cap was that big? I thought maybe over the centuries they had reduced the size. He said, as far as you can tell, that's the original. We have the stereotype of men in the 18th century of being 2 feet tall and weighing 35 pounds. No, and he's a full-grown adult. So how did they get him into that? And they certainly weren't breaking bones after a snowstorm.
They didn't cut his body up.
That's what I'm saying. We had no time for that. I don't think they had equipment for that. You know?
Yeah, okay, so
yeah.
that's still out there, so if
Oh,
you
yeah,
want
you
to
can
go out
visit
and
it,
take
yes.
a picture.
Yeah, it's about a third of a mile from Brookfield Center. Even a third of a mile.
Let's see.
This is Joshua's burial stone. As we enter Brookfield Cemetery, it's almost immediately to the right. The stone was put in 20 years after his death. I imagine to discourage curiosity seekers, probably. And it just discusses the trial execution in Worcester. Well, grass has never grown on the grave. And every time, I've been there probably 4 or 5 times, it's still a bare spot. There's grass all around it. Two stones to the right is his son's grave.
Okay. This is-
Look familiar to anybody? Any Cape visitors here? No?
That's not,
This is Sandwich Center. So if you're at the center, this is immediately to the left. There's a pond, and this building faces the pond.
In Sandwich?
In Sandwich.
On a cape.
Yep. This is the Newcomb Tavern. This is where Bathsheba was born. Her parents and grandparents were innkeepers here. It's still available for rental for $1,000 a night. A little pricey, but it's a beautiful property. Next.
Okay, that was,
This is probably Worcester's most historic property. The second Worcester County Courthouse, 1751. The original courthouse was from 1731 on the same site. In Worcester, as you're driving down Belmont Street to Lincoln Square, all the courthouses have been back left since 1731. In 2002, the 1896 courthouse became, well, it was vacant, and eventually was converted to apartments. Meanwhile, they were building a new courthouse 3 blocks south on Main Street. So, again, all courthouses were on that site from 1731 until about 2002.
and the one that was there more recently is condos.
Right, condos or apartments, either one. I mean, I
Yeah.
think of both.
Yeah,
Yeah.
near the Worcester Memorial Auditorium.
Right. There's also the Major Taylor Museum, the Bicyclist Museum is in the building. In 1800, just a story on where the building's history. In 1800, Charles Bulfinch who designed the new State House in Boston, was hired to design Worcester's new courthouse. So they dismantled this one, moved it a mile and a quarter southeast to Green Street, facing Green Street, very close to where the Blue Sox play, Polo Park. In 1890, as downtown developed, they dismantled it again, piece by piece, and moved it 2 miles northwest to the new elite neighborhood in Worcester, Bancroft Heights, which, if you know, the Antiquarian Society, the very next right is Mass Ave. That's the area. It's actually several streets. This is the only building that was brought to the site, and it's the oldest building on site. Actually, all the homes are 1890s. This home is important for 4 historic events that really had national implication. In 1774, 4,600 farmers many of whom were from Lancaster, farmers and tradesmen from Worcester County. That was half the male adult population in Worcester County. They surrounded the building and forced the British judges out. And Worcester maintained patriot power for the remainder of the Revolution. Boston was still controlled by the British until Evacuation Day. So Boston had a year and a half to go, almost, of being controlled. But Worcester, really, in many ways, this is the beginning of the American Revolution. Ray Raphael in California, a historian, made the point that it really started here. Also Springfield and Great Barrington, although the biggest event was here. They forced the judges to walk down what is now Main Street and knock their wigs off as they walked by. When I spoke for the Lexington Daughters of the American Revolution, and I know it's provoking, And I said, many say this is where the American Revolution began. I said, not the Revolutionary War. We know that began in Lexington. But when I said that, it was like I had thrown a grenade. My chairs were pushing back. I'm not exaggerating. There were gasps in the audience. I said, not the war. I said the revolution. But, I mean, they took photos after. I guess they got over it. But
Got a little bit
yeah.
bent out of shape.
In 1778, the Bathsheba Spooner trial, which is unimportant just for its sensational nature. She was the first woman executed in the new United States. It's the first capital trial in the United States, the first mass execution post-declaration. It's the most complete court transcript in the American 18th century. And Prudence, who was an enslaved tavern maid, likely gave the first testimony from an African American following the declaration of the trial. In 1781, in Barrie, an enslaved man whose parents were natives of Ghana escaped from his brutal master. A year earlier, Massachusetts declared all men are free and equal in the Constitution. He went about a mile away to another farm where he worked as a free man. His old slave master caught up with him, beat him severely, dragged him back to his property, locked him in the sawmill. Somehow he escaped. I think it was a negotiated escape. We're not sure how he got out. Went back with his new employer, who decided to make it a test case against slavery in Massachusetts. Now, there had been test cases before, but they were always on legal points. Master promised me at this age, or I have a document from another owner saying I'd be free at this point. This would be the first time where a slave with no strings attached would be declared free after 3 or 4 trials by William Cushing of Scituate. Massachusetts thus becoming the first state to make slavery illegal. Now, Pennsylvania will pipe in say 1780, we did it 2 years before, but Pennsylvania conditionalized it. They said women at 18, men at 21. Also, any people who are already existing slaves were slaves until they died. In Vermont, in 1777, they said slavery is illegal, but Vermont did the same. Women 18, men 21. Massachusetts was really the first, with no strings held, to declare slavery is illegal. That doesn't mean all slaves just disappeared in Massachusetts. It was a prior period of maybe the next 15 years before all were truly free, acknowledged as such. And finally, in 1786, does that ring a bell at all historically to anybody? Shays Rebellion. The first rebellion against the United States government. Now, these same thousands of men are now protesting the American government, and they go to the same site, and they wanted to throw the American judges out. Artemus Ward, who was the commander-in-chief before Washington, a couple of weeks, he's from Shrewsbury, he stood before the door and did not allow their entry. They came back a couple of times. It also happened in Taunton, Concord, Northampton, Great Barrington, and most famously where, does anyone know? Springfield. There's actually a battle in Springfield, 3 or 4 were killed in Springfield. So the farmers of central and western Mass were protesting excessive taxation. Their farms were being seized. The rebellion eventually lost steam and petered out. 2 or 3 were executed in Boston, I think. Next. It's private home today. By the way, the front door was replaced in the 1950s, and I mentioned that. It's now the back door to the garden. And I'm telling you that because under that door walked John Adams, Sam Adams, John Hancock, Bathsheba Spooner, Quock Walker, Levi Lincoln, Robert Tree Payne. So I'm glad they saved the door. Just so we got.
Okay, well, I read somewhere that this is where she was tried.
Yes.
Because I saw a picture from a newspaper article that said the Old South Church.
Right. This is where the indictment took place.
Ah, okay.
And a couple of thousand turned out for that. Because of the size of the crowd, they realized that the trial could never take place here, so they moved it to the old meeting house, which is just behind where City Hall is now.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Acting Governor John Hancock, courtesy of the Museum of Fine Arts. Hancock organized the trial. Hancock knew Worcester well. His uncle had a home right at Lincoln Square, facing Lincoln Square at the bottom of Belmont Street. His home was maybe 300 feet to the right. It stood till the 19-teens, I think. He inherited his uncle's home. He owned a 150-acre property, a strip of property from Worcester to the Holden Line, which he eventually sold to Stephen Salisbury. 6 days following the battles of Lexington and Concord, we have a letter from John Hancock in Worcester. He's with Sam Adams. Remember, the British attacked Concord not just for weaponry. They had a hit list of spies thereafter, and Adams and Hancock were at the top of the list. So they were hiding out in Worcester. We're not sure where. 9 out of 10 chances, probably at his home. They were. They were on their way to the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. Paul Revere may have been with them. There's no indication in the letter that he was, but he was hiding somewhere. So it's very possible he at least dropped by at some point. They had a chest with them, about this big, full of secret papers, which Sam Adams likely destroyed. The chest is now in the Worcester Historical Museum, empty. Okay. If you've ever been to the Smithsonian, there's a doorway. And if you know the new State House in Boston, the left side, the wing of the property, that was added in the 1920s, I think, or 90s. That's where John Hancock's home used to stand. When it was knocked down, supposedly that doorway made its way to the Smithsonian. Actually, that doorway was restored in Boston recently. The actual doorway at the Smithsonian is from the Worcester property. People
And
get
they took
confused
that down
that.
about the time of the Civil War?
Took what down?
John Hancock's house in Boston.
That's a good question. That sounds about right. 1860s, I think. You're right.
And then after that, they made a move to preserve
Yeah,
houses.
people were horrified when that came down.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they were.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, next.
Yep.
Come on.
Thanks. Levi Lincoln, this is courtesy of the National Portrait Gallery, not a great image. Levi Lincoln was the Bathsheba in the men's attorney, defense attorney. He's from Hingham, related to the president, as all the Lincolns trace their roots to Hingham. He made his way to Northampton, where he received training as a lawyer, and then went to he's at the battlefield of Lexington. I'm not sure how active he was, but he was there. And then he went to Worcester during the Revolution. Became Worcester's leading attorney in the late 18th century. He, not too long after, became Attorney General under Jefferson, and then Governor of Massachusetts, and then his son became governor also. People always assume Lincoln Square in Worcester is named after the president. It's named after him. If you've ever been to Sturbridge Village, when you drive in, the big former country curtains, the yellow home with the white columns, that's the Lincoln home. That's the home of his son, which used to stand on Elm Street in Worcester. It was taken down piece by piece when the Chancery building went in. They moved it to Sturbridge Village in the early 1950s. I think it's vacant now still. Abraham Lincoln actually visited that home in 1848, being a cousin of theirs. There's talk of dismantling it again and bringing it back to Worcester. Not likely, but it would be nice. Robert Tree Payne, courtesy of Massachusetts Historical Society. He was the prosecutor, former signer of the Declaration. Does the name Treat Williams ring a bell to anybody? The actor? No. He's on CSI. I was trying to watch on TV, but he died a year ago and was killed in a motorcycle accident. Pretty well-known character. He had the lead role in the movie Hair also. But this is his great ×7 cousin.
He was a
That's
signer of
Robert
the
Treat Payne,
Declaration.
Treat Williams. That's the name.
And he was involved in the trial?
He was a prosecutor.
The prosecutor. Doesn't want to land on, okay.
Of course, Abigail Adams, courtesy of Museum of Fine Arts. Few people were as politically astute in Massachusetts as Abigail Adams. So when writing the book, I said she had to have addressed this somehow. As they say, she read all the newspapers. And so I did that quote I gave you. After I wrote the book, I discovered that John Adams was Bathsheba's second cousin. They had the same great-grandparents. So there's no question in my mind. She's referring to the trial in that quote I gave you. Of course, Worcester's Union Station, 1911. This was the site of the gallows, the execution site, most likely. To my back left, maybe a third of a mile, the main post office. That was also a gallows site, but this is more likely. This was used more contemporarily with Bathsheba's time. Also, this is 500 feet to the right directions, to the north of the Common. So this is more likely.
So she marched from the courthouse or
From the jail.
from the jail?
Mm-hmm. So the jail was at Lincoln Square, and what Lincoln Square is now.
Lincoln Square to Washington Square. This is Washington Square?
This is Washington Square, right? Yep.
Right.
So the four convicts, where'd they go? Where'd the bodies go? The two British men, being enemies, being poor, being foreigners, likely ended up under the gallows. So a few people visiting, traveling through Union Station today would realize that two most infamous British soldiers of the Revolution under them, the remains. Bathsheba was buried to the left. I'll get more into that in a minute. Up here, about a half mile away. No more than that, a mile away. And then the mystery is Ezra Ross. He's from Topsfield, the teenager. This sounds like a Hollywood scene, but it actually happened. It was a 95-degree day, extremely humid, July 2nd. As the four convicts approached the scaffold, a storm to end all storms broke out. Nooses were flying, horses were neighing, women were fainting at the scaffold. Finally, they had their nooses around their necks. The sun breaks out, all executed. Bathsheba had requested an autopsy, which was done shortly after, obviously, about a half hour after execution. Again, the British men are buried under. But where is Ezra Ross? He's put on a cart and he's shipped off to Topsfield. Now, you or I would have taken probably 9 or 10 hours to get there in 1778. How did they get a body on a cart in that heat to Topsfield? It would take them 15, 16 hours probably. They did it somehow. Again, bodies were not preserved until the Civil War with formaldehyde or alcohol, soldiers. So they weren't preserving his body. But if they had accessed ice in 1778, that would have lasted 10 minutes. They could have packed the body with straw, maybe, how effective that would have been for how long. But he's buried alongside his minister counselor in Topsfield.
Didn't his family try to get him spared?
Oh yes, they sent a petition to the legislature. Yeah, didn't work. Yeah. Next. A colorized print of Worcester's Green Hill Park in 1905. Bathsheba is 99 out of 100 points most likely buried here. This was her sister's estate, her favorite sister. They certainly wouldn't have buried her on a common. That she was a shameful execution. I don't know if she would have gone. The Mechanics Cemetery in Worcester was not founded yet, so she's probably here. We don't know where. To my back, what eventually became a 40-room mansion in where her brother-in-law and sister lived, just behind her. Her brother-in-law, by the way, was John Green, who was the best-known physician in Massachusetts. Now, there were more famous doctors to us during that time, Otis and Warren, but they're famous for their association with the Revolution. John Green was probably the most respected physician in Massachusetts, and he had 2 or 3 doctors after him in the family. But she's buried here somewhere. The question is, if your favorite sister was executed and you were burying her, would you want her burial site within window distance, or would you want her as far as possible from your window? So I'm not sure where she went. It's been suggested she's buried where the golf course is now, the back left, over here. No, she's buried under the silo, which was behind the house. No, she's buried in the yard in front of the house. No, she's beyond the Massachusetts Veterans Memorial, which is over here. No one knows. And keeping in mind that over the centuries, Green Hill Park has gone from forest to pasture, pasture to forest, making it all more difficult. So my wife and I have walked this property 9,000 times. We've been there since the mid-90s. We walk 6 times a week. And every now and then we'll see a stone, maybe. Again, I don't think they would mark that. Just keep curiosity seekers away. The most famous man associated with this property is Andrew Haswell Green, who became controller of New York City. He's the man who held the purse strings, essentially, in New York in the 19th century. He's responsible for hiring Olmsted and Vaux to design Central Park. He had a lot of clashes with Olmsted. Olmsted wanted to spend freely, and he said, you can't do that. The park, he went 3 times over budget, something like that. He also helped found the Natural History Museum in New York, was responsible for money given to the founding of the New York Philharmonic, as well as the New York Library, Public Library. Most importantly, he's the man who brought all the boroughs of New York City together into one city in the 1890s. As he was approaching his property, his apartment building, as an 80-year-old, for a luncheon date, a man came out of the bushes and stabbed him repeatedly, killed him. He mistook him for his wife's lover, mistaken identity. It was behind headlines across the country. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And you live somewhere.
Right, so I'm in Green Hill Park, so right here. I'm, how far down? I'm probably 700 feet to the right on the other side of the street.
Yeah, and it was a family secret, but it died with one of the family members.
Which secret?
A secret of the burial site.
Yeah, my book I mentioned that Esther Forbes, who wrote Paul Revere in his times, she also wrote Johnny Tremaine. You've probably seen Johnny Tremaine, Walt Disney. But she indicated at a signing party, she wrote a novel based on this, that the only person who knows where Bathsheba was buried isn't telling. And that was 1940. A long time ago. You know, something knows. We'll probably never know. And of course, how do you find the property? The body would have lasted, the coffin would have lasted, what, 10 years maybe? In Massachusetts soil, 20 years. The bones could disintegrate in decades in our soil. So nothing would remain. I think that's the last one. Just addressing a few of the most frequently asked questions. Excuse me. What inspired you to write this book? When my family bought our first home across the street from Green Hill Park, a friend came by for dinner a few weeks later. He reminded me of the infamous tale of Bathsheba Spooner. A lifelong student of Worcester's history, especially as a village during the Revolution, I wanted to learn more. This being the late 90s. Besides a mid-19th century essay and the odd article or two, no full-scale study had ever been done. I decided that my first book would tackle the notorious episode. While in the middle of research, and with the book about one-third written, Deborah Navis's book appeared in 1999. Excuse me. Well-written and scholarly, I admired her contribution, yet I still hungered for a less academic approach, one which would comprehensively relate the details of the case. While nonfiction, I wanted to tell the story more like a novel, excuse me. And I wanted to do more than just relate a true-to-life melodrama. Since the early 19th century, historians, poets, and other writers from eastern Massachusetts have been Boston-centric in their retelling of the colony's role in the Revolution, to the neglect of many other towns. Worcester's contribution to the conflict and to the events leading up to the opening gunshot looms dramatically larger than the mere 1,800 residents of 1778. I chose the tale of Bathsheba and her murderous lovers as the frame upon which to reconstruct Worcester's significant role in the rebellion. Just a couple of anecdotal stories. In January of 1775, two farmers were seen walking down what is now Belmont Street in Worcester toward Lincoln Square. Go out on a Saturday afternoon to see farmers whose clothes were in immaculate condition. The next day, they're at what is now Lincoln Square, and they have sketchbooks, still dressed as farmers. You know, something you'll see every day, farmers sketching out. Of course, they were mapping roads in and out of Worcester. They had been sent by General Gage in Boston. Worcester had cannon behind the meeting house. Concord also had cannon behind the meeting house. A week before Concord and Lexington, another spy was sent to Worcester to recheck the routes. Went back to Boston. All the men got together and discussed, is it going to be Concord or Worcester? Well, let's see, Concord's 20 miles from Boston. It's pretty much a straight topographic shot, last mile or two a little hilly. Worcester is 40 miles from Boston, and topographically, as soon as you're in Westboro, it's hill after hill after hill. So Gage figured that by the time we get to Worcester and turn around to Boston, how many of us would be left? And probably the biggest reason Gage did not want to go to Worcester, he considered the Worcester Patriots the craziest in Massachusetts. What they had done at the courthouse. It was also safe to be in Worcester. And many of the Boston Patriots fled to Worcester after the Tea Party. They weren't safe in Boston, so they went west. And they were getting away with a lot. And Gage knew that, and Gage thought, in what condition would the troops be by the time we made it back to Boston? So Concord was chosen. On April 19th, day of Concord and Lexington, a rider, I guess sounds like a Hollywood scene, comes galloping down what is Main Street, stops at the town meeting house. The Minutemen are already gathering behind the meeting house. They've heard rumors from Concord. It's a few hours later. He shouts, Lexington and Concord have been attacked. Horse collapses, dies. The next day, they muster him back and then they head to Cambridge. Of course, the Worcester men did not make it to Lexington and Concord. It was too far. So they gathered for Bunker Hill. Bissell got a new horse, Israel Bissell, the next day, jumped on the horse, rode to Leicester, and then continued on to Philadelphia, horse after horse. From Watertown, he rode a total of 300 miles. His jaunt from Watertown to Worcester is considered the longest single run by one horse that day. Again, he went 300 miles. Paul Revere ran 13, but who's heard of Israel Bissell?
Nobody.
He's the pride and joy of Windsor, Connecticut.
Windsor, Connecticut.
Yeah. How did her father's notoriety contribute to Miss Spooner's downfall? Brigadier General Timothy Ruggles, legendary attorney, judge, hero of the French and Indian War, and Speaker of the Massachusetts House in 1765, made clear his devotion to the king when refusing to vote with the colony's delegation to New York in condemning the newly imposed stamp tax. Along with Governor Hutchinson, Ruggles became regarded as the Bay Colony's most notorious loyalist. Next to youngest Bathsheba, had apparently always been his favorite child. Now married to Bostonian Joshua Spooner in Brookfield, her isolation from her father, several miles distant and nearly 70 miles from the colony's capital, likely only distressed a dynamic, erratic personality such as hers. Her father's removal to Staten Island, of course, only worsened the situation, further exacerbated by her own loyalist stance. Was Bathsheba insane? Playing armchair psychologist from nearly 2.5 centuries away is tenuous for a professional, for me impossible. We can only speculate, and the facts might lend themselves to characterizing Miss Spooner as imbalanced. She had a sharp temper and was involved sexually with at least 2 and more likely 5 men, none of whom were her husband. She freely welcomed 2 enemy POWs into her home and on occasion a handsome teenager in her husband's presence. Her actions were often erratic. She allowed her 2-year-old daughter to touch her husband's corpse. She jeopardized the future lives of her 3 surviving children. She lied incessantly. Would we be safe in assuming that she at least exhibited signs of a disordered personality? Although her attorney suggested insanity during the trial, it would take many more decades before such a defense would be admissible in a court of law. Was teenager Ezra Ross truly guilty, and of what? This is one of the hardest to answer, and the overall situation perhaps the most poignant of the saga. Age-wise, the 18th century freely condemned teenagers. But what exactly was his role? It appears that he had had no knowledge of the mischievous March 1st plot before that date. He had spent many days before at his Topsfield home. Had Bathsheba sent him any letters while there? Given the slow pace of mail, it's unlikely. He turned up in Brookfield only hours before the murder, which he did discuss with the 2 British men and with Bathsheba. And keeping in mind that weeks earlier he had tried to poison Spooner and had planned to try again before leaving for Topsfield, his background certainly did not incline the jury to consider his role more leniently. And just a couple of readings, finally. First reading is from Bathsheba's petition. It's actually the entire petition. So her first exam, they concluded that she was not pregnant, which Boston okayed. The second exam they did not okay, but Worcester decided to go ahead with one anyways. And this is where she's petitioning them for the second exam. May it please your honor, with unfeigned gratitude, I acknowledge the favor you lately granted me a reprieve. I must beg leave once more, humbly to be at your feet, and to represent to you that though the jury of matrons that were appointed to examine into my case have not brought it in my favor, yet that I am absolutely certain of being in a pregnant state, and above 4 months advanced in it, and the infant I bear was lawfully begotten. I am earnestly desirous of being spared till I shall have been delivered of it. I must humbly address your honors, not understanding my great unworthiness, and take my deplorable case into your compassionate consideration. What I bear, and already perceive to be animated, is more of the fault of her who bears it, and has, I beg leave to say, a right to the existence which God has begun to give me. Your honor's humane Christian principles, I am certain, must lead you to desire to preserve life rather than to destroy it. Suffer me, therefore, with all earnestness, to beseech your honors to grant me such a further length of time, at least, as that there may be the fairest and fullest opportunity to have the matter fully ascertained, and as in duty bound, shall during my short continuance pray. And again, Boston did not authorize another exam, but Worcester went ahead, which did prove she was pregnant. Most interesting line is, and the infant I bear was lawfully begotten. Really? She had not had relations with her husband for at least a year previous. People in different audiences, I tend to agree, have suggested that Bathsheba was trying to cover her legal tracks, that if the child had been born, he would have been open to inheritance, I guess. It's a strange situation. I don't know anything about inheritance or execution law in the 18th century, but here's a boy being born to a mom who was about to be executed, had worked that way, and a murdered father, or a murdered foster father, I should say, and an executed real father. So what was he inheriting? Who was he inheriting from? And keep in mind, there were 2 wealthy families, the Spooners and the Ruggles, so there would have been some money involved. So maybe she did it for that reason? I don't know. Not sure. The next reading is from the night of the murder. So Joshua was enjoying dinner in Brookfield Center with Dr. King and his wife. A lookout was set up by the parlor door window, as Joshua was expected at any time. Bathsheba called into the kitchen for some supper for the men. Brooks and Buchanan took a seat near Ross, helping themselves to a bowl of flip. A few minutes later, Mrs. Stratton, the housekeeper, brought them dinner. At the center of town, Joshua was passing the evening amiably. He was, in the words of innkeeper Ephraim Cooley, pleasant and sociable, sharing a glass of rum with Dr. King and his wife after dinner. Dr. King testified that Spooner departed at the same time as he and his wife, well between 8 and 9 o'clock. The Kings, however they were traveling, unfortunately did not offer to accompany Spooner home. At the Spooners, according to the testimony of Sarah Stratton, Bathsheba took her dinner in the kitchen with a Mr. Gray and his partner, men further identified simply as two boarders. Mysteriously, outside of the few mentions they receive in the housekeeper's testimony, their names never reappear. The second unnamed boarder retired once dinner was finished. In the parlor, Stratton served rum to Buchanan, Brooks, and Ross, who had been drinking for about 45 minutes, not including any alcohol they may have consumed prior to arriving in Brookfield. Each took a turn as a lookout. And I discussed the consumption of alcohol in the 18th century. John Adams, who was quick to criticize excessive drinking when he rolled out of bed in the morning, had a hit of rum. There was the pre-breakfast drink, the breakfast drink, the post-breakfast drink, the pre-lunch drink, the lunch drink. It was alcohol all day long. I imagine it kept the men with their intense labor, kept them going through the day, probably. And I was reading recently that even today, 80% of murders committed in the country are committed by people under having abused one substance or another. So things haven't changed all so much. Spooner, in high and possibly intoxicated spirits, left Cooley's with no reason to suspect that this would be his final walk. As he had banished Buchanan and Brooks from his home 2 weeks earlier, he did not expect to see them ever again. He had also bid farewell to Ross at about the same time. Further, Spooner had never given any indication that he believed his wife wished him dead. The night was cold. Although only a short distance from his home, Spooner may have wished he had taken his horse. If he had, his evening might have turned out very differently. One of the conspirators saw Joshua approach. Brooks left the parlor to stand within what was referred to as the small gate entryway, which led into the kitchen. Before leaving the room, he picked up a foot-long log from the hearth. Joshua approached, the crunching snow the only sound disturbing the silence. Bathsheba remained in the kitchen, her children asleep by the fire. It was just before 9 o'clock, as Buchanan later wrote, and then was the time for the devil to shew his power over them who had forsaken God. I'll leave you hanging there. Any questions? Sure.
Was it a jury trial or a magistrate?
Jury trial.
Jury trial.
Of course, a jury for peers, all men, all white, all patriots.
Have you followed her lineage as far as her bloodline? And where are we today with that? What do we know?
Not really. I remember one day scrolling through Ruggles' Descendants, and I'm not exaggerating, through 20 minutes I was scrolling name like this, that fast, scrolling thousands upon thousands. I haven't traced her direct line. I know there are a lot of Ruggles in Worcester area, especially, obviously, Hardwick, Brookfield, through there. A lot of Spooners, so more Ruggles. In fact, I'd say 3/4 of the talks I've given someone, I've spoken to a Ruggles, probably 3/4 of the talks. So maybe quite a few around.
We had a woman in Lancaster, and she ran, I think, council on aging, do you know?
No.
Or history before you? Anyway, her name was Judy Spooner.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't remember.
And Ruggles Station in Boston, of course, is named after the family, the tea star.
And Elaine Spooner just died a few months ago, and she was married to Norton Spooner,
Okay.
who was an optician, and I bought his business when he passed.
Oh, really?
From
Oh, wow.
Elaine Spooner.
Wow. There are two Spooner lines, and it hasn't been made clear. There's the Boston line and the Plymouth line. I'm not entirely sure where Joshua came from. I mean, likely the Boston one, but we don't know.
Got a question. Did she have any communication with her father after, she was
Not likely.
convicted?
Of course, it would have been only by letter. It also,
And he was
as,
at Staten Island at the time?
right, and as you know, all correspondence went through taverns and anything
Tavern.
with, even if it was coded to Timothy Ruggles, would have been opened up, read.
Did he make any comment about her death
No,
after?
no, it's very, very sad. Nothing. He shipped off to
I thought she was his favorite.
Oh yeah, but he heads off to Nova Scotia. Well, she's gone. She's executed. So he's off to Nova Scotia. I haven't read any journals of him. It was possible. I have a feeling he just tried to forget what the entire episode. Tried to block it out, I think.
Was he alone in Nova Scotia, or did he have family
He was
with him?
alone. Son came along to help him. Did the son live with him? I know his son helped him on the property. Another son stayed with his wife in Hardwick. I think he's pretty much alone in Nova Scotia, I think. I'm sorry, what was my question? No, you're okay, sure.
You mentioned a tavern in Lancaster. Was that to celebrate the capitulation at
Yorktown.
Yorktown?
Yes.
And which tavern was that?
The Black Swan?
It was called the Sun, S-U-N.
Oh, the Sun.
Which one was that?
Sun Tavern, and we have never been able
Oh,
to
where?
substantiate exactly where that
Oh.
is.
Okay.
But the mansion house where Greenleaf lived
Mm-hmm.
is very close, to the center of town. And there was a tavern very close, Lancaster Hotel.
Right.
Yeah.
And so probably right along that
that-
main street
Okay.
somewhere.
All right.
Mm-hmm.
The other problem, there were so many taverns in towns more than I realized. I think you mentioned in the book, I think 20% of Boston's houses served alcohol.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, like the Bathsheba's Tavern, where Joshua had his last dinner, there's a tavern, Brookfield Inn is right in the center of town. And I fantasized that'd be great if that were the tavern. It was built in the 1760s, which I checked. But it turns out that wasn't the tavern. There was another tavern across the street, which is no longer there, which may have been the tavern. But,
Okay, thank you.
sure. Who's, sure.
I'm intrigued when you said Worcester had the reputation of being the craziest, meaning emotions,
Radical,
patriots.
radical. Yeah.
Just so they would, because it's still kind of that way, isn't it? Well, no, I think of Central Mass as being a little bit,
Quirky? Yeah. At one point, the Patriots went to Timothy Payne's home. He had abandoned his property, the judge, and they took a sword and slashed his portrait. In lieu of that. Yeah, they were pretty wild. It was dangerous to be a Tory in Massachusetts. I mentioned in the book. Tory Fort Lane is a road little country lane that runs between Tannock Square and Worcester and Holton. And in 1775, I think it's in the book, Tories in Worcester were so terrified, they left the downtown area, which was really the entire part of town back then, and went 5 miles west and hung out there for a few weeks.
And there's a name in Worcester, Chandler. Now, the Chandlers were big.
Big Tories.
Big Tories.
Yep. Chandler Hill, of course, and not Chandler Street. Belmont Hill used to be known as Chandler Hill.
So they all left.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. Good question. Were the Chandlers?
Because we have
joining them?
Chandlers in Lancaster,
Chandlers
too.
were pretty. They were pretty powerful in Worcester. They probably stayed put. Maybe they went to Tannock. It's possible. Yeah. He was pretty well connected, Chandler. Who's heard of the story before? Anyone? Yeah, I think it had this happen in Philadelphia or New York. We hear of it, but maybe not. I mean, it did happen in a small village. These things fall off the screen. Has anybody heard of Levi Weeks? No, there's a good example of it. Levi Weeks was a gentleman in New York who was murdered and put into a well, like Bathsheba. 20 years later, he was defended by prosecutor defense, Burr and Hamilton, and yet no one here has heard of that. And this was New York City, New York. So these stories tend to disappear. What do you think? Why would the then state have executed her while pregnant?
I don't get it.
Yeah.
Well, didn't you say the test came back negative?
So the first exam proved they assessed that she was not pregnant.
Okay, next.
Concluded. Second exam concluded that she was pregnant.
Okay, and then what's the third?
The third exam was a matron at the jail examined Bathsheba a day before the execution,
Okay.
and said she was pregnant. So it's ironic you accept the first one, but a month later you reject those two.
Do you think it had anything to do with her reputation in those days for a woman being with several men?
Possibly. And the men she was with, right?
Absolutely, so I
Yeah.
think that might have been in there,
And bad man.
It was also such animosity against her father,
sure.
you know? Deborah Navis makes the point in the book that on the committee in Boston was Joshua's stepbrother. It's possible that he would have swayed the council to vote against Bathsheba. I would counter that. There were just as many people. I mean, what's the population of Lancaster now?
8,000.
8,000. Okay.
Roughly.
Boston had 18,000. So everybody knew everyone. It was half the size of Shrewsbury. you know. So, my point being that there were probably just as many people who had known favorably, had remembered her father, and would have voted in favor of the other exam. Well, I can't believe they're just being callous. I do think that the stress of the revolution probably caused them to move in that direction. Inflation is running about 8 times what our rate is running. Give me an idea of how bad it was. Men under the age of 35 are largely vacant from towns. Women are running estates, running farms, and the stress level is pretty bad in the state. So I'm sure they said you had your chance, you had an exam. It was not an easy thing to organize. It proved you were not pregnant, we're done with this.
And the sheriff signed off on it.
You're right, he gave his signature.
He signed off on the hanging, they were hung until dead.
He was connected pretty well.
Would they hang 1, 2, 3, 4, or
4 in a row. So 3 men and then Bathsheba.
one each hour? Because
Oh, no, altogether, as far as you know.
Oh, because it
all
was
of us.
from 12 to 4.
Where did you see that? I haven't seen that.
I saw that
Okay.
in a reading that I
Huh.
did of the court
That's
case.
interesting.
Yeah, 1 at 12, 1 at 1, 1 at 2, 1 at 3.
You know, the only reason I would question that, it was low 90s. I don't
And there was that awful storm that came up out of nowhere.
Right. I'm surprised it's possible. Weather-wise, it'll be a little strange.
And it's a spectacle for the people. It was a big, I mean, if the judges marched down the street, it was a
Right.
cause for people to come out and watch.
Also,
It was like a show.
Right, it was used, our term, mentioned in the book, our term gala probably comes from the word gallows. This was Celebration Day. I mean, there were jugglers, they were selling alcohol, newspapers, they were
And
dancing.
the big
It was
attraction is to watch
insane.
somebody
It's like
hang.
it's entertainment.
Oh, yeah, this was the entertainment of the day.
That's,
Yeah, but
It was
think
a
of the
circus.
gladiators, that was
Yeah.
entertainment, when
Yes.
people saw blood.
Yeah.
Or think of hockey and
Sure,
sports.
right. More blood, the better. eh?
Oh, no, it's not a good hockey game, I mean, people must kind of
Also-
gravitate
Yeah.
that way.
Bathsheba having her autopsy, that would be awkward as they're doing that. And it's possible. But that means several people from the execution would have had to leave autopsy, right? They would have missed the big show.
Yeah, and the sheriff himself would not have been the hangman. The hangman would have had a
Right,
mask.
I
over
read
his
across name, I
face?
forget his name. Yeah, it would be someone else.
Yeah, not Greenleaf.
No,
What was the date again, 1778?
July 2nd, 1778.
So it was about 100 years after the witch trials. And on those trials, everybody would come out for the entertainment of watching people get hung.
Yep.
People really have a bad streak
Yeah.
for
Wanting
that
to
kind
watch
of
gore.
bizarre.
And I've commented, isn't it interesting that the 3 most famous Massachusetts cases all involve women? 17th century, Salem witch trials, 18th century, Bathsheba Spooner, 19th century, Lizzie Borden.
Right.
In fact, the Lizzie Borden case, it had been rumored, not at the trial itself, but around the trial, that the reason she was acquitted, they did not want a repeat of Bathsheba Spooner's execution, the shame brought against that. Who knows? So it had an impact apparently against that, but, yeah. I don't know if that says more, like I said, more about us or about them, but it's 3 women trials.
Questions? Oh, I want to thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, for your great work.